Hello everybody, this is Mike Fauché. Today I'd like to do a video on Blue Iris, which is a very powerful recording software for your IP cameras or other types of security cameras. Hope you enjoy the video, and as always, if you haven't already subscribed, please do so and click that notifications icon so you'll be notified of future content. I recently did a short video on Amcrest camera and how to configure the camera. Today we're going to actually take that camera and add it to the Blue Iris system, and at the same time cover all the different features and basic configuration of Blue Iris. So I hope you enjoy the video. Okay, as I mentioned in the video on the Amcrest IP camera, I've been using a product called Blue Iris for a number of years now. Today, to me it's important to have to be able to keep an eye on things when I'm away, when I'm at work, or when I'm traveling. I like to make sure that I can keep an eye on what's going on around the house. So for me, this has been a critical part of my routine and been a critical part of my system for like I said, a number of years. There are obviously many options you can choose from for security recording, including NVRs, your NAS units, and there's many ways to record your IP streams. There's also competitor products like iSpy Connect and probably half a dozen others. Ultimately, you got to use which one is comfortable for you. For me, the ones I've tried, I've always resorted back to Blue Iris. So ultimately, this is what I want to talk about today. I want to go through the configuration, the settings, and then we'll add that actual camera that we configured on my last video. Now, right out front, I'd like to mention this is not a free product. There is a 15-day free demo, but if you decide to buy it or keep it, it'll cost you about $69. It is a one-time fee. However, if you do want updates and support in subsequent years, you'll have to pay an upgrade fee. So otherwise, the product keeps running without getting updates. And I also believe, at least when I got mine, there was a small couple dollar charge for the mobile apps, so you'll have to take that into consideration as well. At the end of the day, it really matters how it works for you, what it does for you, and whether or not you find this valuable. For me, it's worth every penny because, as I mentioned, it's an integral part of my system and my routine when I travel. So let's talk a little bit about requirements, PC requirements. This is obviously software that installs on your PC, and you need to meet certain minimum requirements. And it's a really difficult question to answer, and there is a kind of a guide on their website. I believe it's probably slightly dated, but basically they mention a dual core with around 2 gigs of RAM, with the recommendation significantly higher than that. But I'll let you look at the recommendations and see what you think. What I found in terms of actual experience is that it just runs better with a little bit more power, and it has a lot to do with how many cameras you have and the resolution of the cameras that you're running. If you're running 1080p or 720p IP cameras, it's not going to be a problem. But if you're running high megapixel cameras like some of the ones I have, it matters quite a bit, especially if you're going to process these videos. And when you have as many cameras as I do, I have 12 cameras here. When we're going to add the 13th one as a test, it does tend to chomp up your CPU power. There's some settings that we'll go over that kind of also walk through how to optimize or minimize that impact to your CPU. If you're looking at my screen right now, down at the bottom, we're showing about 38%, 37% CPU usage and about 5.2 gigs of RAM. So RAM isn't too much of an issue. Usually if you have 8 or more on your system, you should be fine, even with this many cameras. CPU is, again, it's going to depend on configuration, number of cameras, and the resolution of the cameras. So let's get into how you set this thing up, how you configure it. Obviously, you have to download and install the software. That's number one. And once you get it installed, I'm going to show you the basic. You obviously won't have this many cameras installed, but up here is the settings and info screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through all the ones that I believe are critical to this, making this work correctly, and getting the functionality out of it. There's hundreds and hundreds of options in this thing, so you can go as deep as you want to and configure as many things as you want. That'll be ultimately up to you. But I'm going to show you the basics as far as what's needed to make it work. So the first thing that's right out of the gate is naming and then your activation code, which you will obviously have to have once you decide to purchase it. Down at the bottom is just some basic housekeeping stuff. When do you want to be prompted for updates? Do you want it to automatically download and install, so on and so forth. So you can kind of tune that. I've left mine as the default, but you can kind of tune that to however you want. The next tab is far more important, and that's your clips and archiving. Now, the clips and archiving is what happens when one of your cameras takes a recording. The very first entry is the database. That's usually set up by default when you install the software. I wouldn't touch it. I would just leave it where it is. You can move it and relocate it to where you want, but I personally don't. I leave it on my C drive. The thing that's far more important is down here under folders. So can be a little bit confusing until you kind of understand it and play around with it. But under the first setting, under new folders, you establish a path of where the new clippings are going to be. Meaning when I record something or one of the camera records something, it's going to pop that clip into this new folder. And that's fine, and that's kind of what I want. I want to record to the fastest drive possible. This machine I have runs off in SSD, so my initial recording will be to the C drive. However, down here I can set some limits. So what this is telling me is that when the clip reaches more than 2 days old, it's going to be moved to the stored folder. So the way that I have it configured right now is that every clip that goes through and gets stored to the new folder will automatically get moved to a stored folder after 2 days. So if I look at my stored configuration, that's actually going to a completely separate drive. So what I've done is plugged in a USB external drive into my system, and after 2 days all of my archived clips get transferred to that external drive. So basically allows me to keep my C drive from filling up within a couple of days, and basically keeping everything on an external drive. So in the event I need to move it, I certainly can. Plus, in my case, my external drive is 4 terabytes of external storage versus 512 gig SSD. So it's a completely different beast. So I don't obviously want to store on the C drive for too long. So this is critical, and you can take this to the nth degree, but this is basically, in my configuration, all you need to do. Users is probably not all that necessary unless you have multiple users you want to configure with limited rights. For me, it's just me, so that really makes changes in this or views it, so I'm not going to create a bunch of users. But if you do have people that need to access the cameras even through a web browser or through a mobile app, then you probably want to create some users on this, because you want to be able to control what they can access and can't access. Okay, this next tab called Web Server is also extremely critical, and it's critical for a couple reasons. Number one, and most importantly, is security. To be able to access this thing outside your network, you're going to have to do some additional stuff, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, this is going to configure itself to the local machine. So whatever computer you have this installed on, it's got the IP address that's going to pick up, and that's what it's going to use for both internal and external. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit here. You most likely will not have to change your local LAN address, because as I mentioned, it picked it up from the installation. Where you're probably going to have some challenges and you're going to have to make some decisions is in the remote external access. Now, this is it's not really a limitation of the software. It's an option they chose to do. If you want to access this, you basically have 3 choices. 2 of them aren't very good. The first option is obviously to use just a different port or the same port and port forward your router to this particular computer. I would highly recommend against that because number one, it's not secured. It's not an HTTPS connection. It'll just be a port forward. In terms of being able to use an HTTPS connection, it is certainly possible, but out of the box it's not. You have to run and install a program called S-Tunnel, which allows you to configure basically an encrypted port. So and then Blue Iris will use that connection to allow you to access outside your network. On the surface, that actually works really well. The problem is S-Tunnel is rather convoluted to set up, so you'll have to do a little bit of homework and research if you want to actually hook that up. My choice or my preference is I don't port forward anything, so what I do is I access everything through VPN. So if you use the VPN that you already have either in your NAS unit or your router or set one up separately, use something free that's been vetted out, something like OpenVPN. That's your best way to port into your network. It's a little less convenient, obviously, because you have to log into your VPN, but it's ultra critical for security. So I would not do it unprotected, so I wouldn't do any type of port forwarding to your native IP address, and I'll let you decide whether or not you want to install and run S-Tunnel. If you do a couple of searches on Google, you'll find how they actually set up S-Tunnel, and if you're comfortable with that, that's a great solution. If you're not comfortable with that, I would recommend the VPN. Now, why do I use a VPN and not, set up S-Tunnel? And the main reason is because I want it to work for everything. By using OpenVPN, I can access my entire network, not just my security cameras. So I can choose what I want to get to, when I want to get to it, and how I get to it. So if I want to access one of my servers, if I want to access one of my NAS units, if I want to access anything on my network, I can, and I do it all through one secure connection as opposed to multiple iterations of different things and different cloud services and stuff. So from a security point of view, going through VPN connection is far better than standalone solutions. So that's why I chose not to. This box is checked, but it's not really active because I don't have S-Tunnel installed. So again, take a look at this, decide, get it working locally, and then decide how you want to connect to it from the outside. The next tab I want to talk about is startup. And that basically applies to how do you want the software to work when you start up. The really only important thing is two important things actually, and is basically this first option is usually not checked, and that's to run it as a service. Meaning, if I close this UI that's behind me, if I come up here and hit this power button, the only thing that closes is the user interface. The software still runs in the background, it still picks up my triggers, it still does my recording, it still does everything I need it to do, even if the UI is not up. So to me, this is critical because I just want to turn the computer on, even if I turn it on remotely, and I want to be able to have the software just start and run in the background and not have to worry about it. So to me, this is the very first thing that I configure when I get to this window. The only other thing down here is to prevent your power management from putting the PC to sleep. And you can do that manually through the Windows control panel, or you can do it through here. I prefer to do it through the control panel so I know exactly what I've enabled or disabled. There's not much going on under this other tab, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is just some generic settings. So the next thing I want to talk about is, let's go up here to the first row, is profiles. Now profiles can be very powerful, and you can also get carried away with them, so I would recommend you use them sparingly. The options that are set for the camera. So inactive means basically the camera is disabled, and then continuous recording is kind of what it says, and then you can set up different schedules or profile names that you can attach the schedule to at a later time. So this is basically naming, so it doesn't really do anything by itself, but it names things. The real power comes in the schedules. So the way that Blue Iris works is a little bit complicated when it comes to schedules, because you can set them in a couple different places. Okay, under the schedule, because you have a default schedule, which is what this is, and then you have a basically the ability to attach a specific schedule to a particular camera. So basically what you're doing here is setting up the default schedules by basically drawing times and days that you want things to happen. So obviously in my default schedule here, I'm looking at basically early morning around 7 o'clock all the way to 8 o'clock at night, Monday through Friday. And then weekends I have a different schedule, basically starting at around 10, just about 11 o'clock at night, and shutting down at about 5 in the morning. So this is my default. It doesn't mean it's what I use on every camera, but this is my default. If I don't set a schedule, this is what I get. So again, this is important, and you can choose to whether enable it or disable it, but this is the default configuration. There's not much in the mail servers other than when you're going to configure your email servers. I won't get into that. We're not even going to bother with FTP servers. The mobile devices is basically everything that has the app installed that's connecting to your Blue Iris system. So this is a list of all my devices that are actually not only accessing it, but which ones are configured to get notifications. So in terms of the actual main system configuration, that's really all you have to do. That's really the core, and obviously you can make the changes that you think are necessary based on schedules and other things like that, but this is all that's required to make it work, and to make it work the way that you want it to work. From there, we're going to get into individual camera settings, and then ultimately we're going to add the new camera. So let's get over and add, take a look at the options here. If I right click on one of my cameras and I click on camera settings, there's some things that I can actually tune up for this particular camera. So the very first thing that I can do is obviously name it, and that's sort of important because that's what actually shows up in your display. And then it's going to require you a short 3-letter or a short name that it's going to use in URLs and file names, so you can, when you see your recordings, this will be appended to the recording, so that you don't have a big mishmash of stuff and trying to figure out which recording is which. The other thing is on the next tab is the video. This is where the actual camera is configured, and this is really where it establishes the connection to the camera. And this will make more sense when we add one manually, but for now let me just walk you through basically what it has, and then we'll go right into adding a camera and setting it up from scratch. There's obviously different camera types. You have screen capture cameras, you have USB cameras, you have network cameras, but under the network IP cameras, which is what we're doing here, you can actually configure it. Now, the configuration basically is pointing to the camera that's on your network, and as you saw when we actually set up the Amcrest camera, and as you'll see when we add the camera here, this is the IP address it's been given on my network, along with the username and password needed to access the camera. Now once you actually type that in and you do a find and inspect, it's most likely going to find the camera and set everything else up accordingly. It should pull in the necessary ports, and it should also pull in, as you'll see when we go back to the other screen, things like frame rates and stuff like that. So from here, all I really need is the ports, and to basically do that initial configuration. So let me just cancel out of this. So this information here should get pulled in. Things like the max frame rates, the format size, things like that will get pulled in when it actually reads your camera. And if it's not what you think it is, then you need to probably look at the configuration of the camera. You also have an option here to enable overlays, and if you you can add things to the image. You can add text and time. You can add pretty much whatever you want. You can move things around on the screen so that things appear where you want them to be. So again, this is just mostly aesthetics, but that allows you to set that up if you want to. That's pretty much all you need on this page. Audio, obviously, that's up to you. You need to be careful about recording audio. A lot of states don't like it. So I'll let you decide what your legal requirements are for audio. And then the trigger is also very critical, because this is where you set up your motion sensing. So if I look at configure here, it's showing me here on the screen the areas that I am triggering as far as motion sensitivity. So the minimum object size, which as you can see it varies as I slide this, is really going to have to be tuned by you, because it varies from, you know, lighting, sensitivity, shadows, things that can trigger motion sensing will have to be tuned out here, and that's a trial and error thing, and you'll just have to do the best you can with it. And then here, this one's kind of critical, and it helps you with false alarms, is the minimum duration it takes to actually trigger an event. So if something goes flying by and it takes less than a second, it's not going to trigger the event. But anything beyond a second that moves in front of it is going to trigger an event. So you might want to have to increase that a little bit to, depending on the area and things that are going on, you might need to tune that out. Again, there's so many options here that we could spend a whole entire video on how to set these up. So I'll have to really let you experiment with it. But just know that there's a tremendous amount of power in tuning your motion sensing here. Under object detection, as you can see, there's a minimum pixel. Combined with the object size, the contrast, the duration, all these things can make for a kind of sort of complicated way to set, you know, triggers, but a very, very powerful way to set triggers. Moving on to the schedule tab, if I look at the schedule tab, I now have an option to override global schedules, which means that I can actually take this camera and give it a defined schedule. So right now, as you can see, it's running, the override shows 24 hours a day, but I can actually change that to kind of anything I want. So this allows me to actually do a custom configuration for this particular camera, and basically that's allows me to do something unique with that particular camera. Not all that necessary if you're just going to have everything the same, but in my case, since some cameras are pointing inside, some cameras are pointing outside, I want to be able to tune them as needed. And as far as anything real super critical beyond that, this is pretty much all you need in order to customize the camera to do kind of what you want it to do. So you're really basically covering 3 tabs: your general, your video, your schedule, your trigger, also the record tab, which I don't think we covered. So let's talk about that really quickly. And there's really not much to this tab other than that you're saying that whenever there's motion, that whenever there's triggered, whenever the video is triggered, that I want to actually record it. And that's pretty much all you're saying. There is some options down here which is significantly impact your CPU, and that's how long you want your pre-buffer video to take place. So in other words, you can tell the system to kind of record up to, say, 10 seconds of recording all the time for each camera, and then when there's a triggering event, it will have enough in memory to be able to trigger, so that any latency or lag in capturing that item is really stored in buffers. So I don't know if that makes sense, but if somebody walks in front of the camera, there's a delay between the time that image triggers, that gets captured on the camera, triggers the motion sensing, and then from the motion sensing starts a recording. In some cases, that person or item is halfway off the screen or entirely off the screen before the recording starts. This allows me to tailor that buffer. So the downside is the larger the buffer, the more CPU that you're going to use, especially across multiple cameras. Again, if you only have 2 or 3 cameras, it's probably not going to make that big a difference. But just bear in mind that if I crank these up to 10 seconds each, then I'm basically streaming 10 seconds continuously across all my cameras to my computer and recording and deleting that as on the go. So recommend you keep this as low as practical. There's one other critical thing on here that we need to discuss, and it's under file format and compressions. And again, this will have a huge impact on CPU performance. But there's a couple things. So number one is you can define the format. If you use the Blue Iris format, it allows basically more efficient reading and writing, so it takes up less CPU power. If you want to, you can select a different format and experiment with it, so you can really go right out to an MP4, an MPEG-4 file if you want to. The one that really makes a big difference here is the video compression. You can choose how this is recorded, and the most efficient way is the direct-to-disk option. So basically, what this is doing is it's taking all the stream from the camera and recording it right to your hard disk rather than doing any type of pre-processing. If I choose a different encoder, like I might want to choose something else, what's going to happen is it's going to have to process each one of those videos captures and alter the format or add some overlays or do something to the video file before it gets stored. So it slows things up drastically. I wouldn't use it. I would leave it at direct-to-disk options. That's pretty much it for the basic configuration. So now let's walk through adding a camera and let's see how that works. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a camera. We'll come up here to the main menu and say add new camera. So let's give this a name of test, and we'll leave it as, for the short name, we'll call it TST. Okay, something really unique. And again, you can decide how you want to name your stuff. We are using a network IP camera, so we'll leave that alone. We can choose here to enable audio. By default, it's off. And by default, we want to enable motion detection. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to re-encode any files, so we're going to go direct to disk, so we'll need to select that option now. You can change it, as we saw in the earlier part of the video. You can go back and change it at any time. However, this, when you're adding a camera, you might as well do it out of the gate. So we click OK, and it's going to take us to that configuration screen where we have to actually point to the IP address. So once we put the IP address in, we're going to hit Find and Inspect. And there it goes. It's found the camera. And there it is. It sets itself up and everything's good to go. So now all I have to do is change the password and put in the password that I assigned to the camera, which is click OK. And click OK, and there it is. It added the camera. There's our test camera, and it's now pointing to my door. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Now again, when it's configured, you'll notice there's no schedule above it. There's no anything. So I need to go and tune this if I need to. So I can make some options here. And I can go ahead and assign a schedule. So I want to override any schedules on this and go all the time. Click OK. It's going to hit the camera, reset the camera. Okay, so there we have it. We have our cameras configured, ready to go, and it's ready to pick up. So it's been set to the constant record mode, because that's what my profile number 1 is basically working off of constant triggers, as opposed to the schedules that you can see on some of these other cameras where there is no number, so they're using the default schedule. So that's pretty much it for the for adding a camera, and obviously you can go back in and retweak any of the things that we covered on this video. So I hope this gives you a good overview of Blue Iris and the extreme power it has, extreme configurability, a little bit of a learning curve because it is there is a lot of features, and a lot of features always comes with, you know, a learning curve. But like anything else, at the end it's worthwhile, I think. It gives you a lot of power, flexibility, and you can really tune this thing to do what you want. And it scales pretty well. As you can see, even adding this camera here has not increased my CPU by very much, primarily because of the direct-to-disk option. But bear in mind, it's very easy to get into CPU resources if you're not careful how you tune these cameras. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, and don't forget to click that notification. I'll see you on the next video. Don't forget to watch the video on the Amcrest.